afternoon. It is it's a great honor to be here with you, like sitting in a room with your favorite musicians or athletes. I wish for this to be a portrait or landscape of our expanding vocabulary beyond mere definition. Much of what I have written has since been given a voice, and it gives me great hope that there are others who have been thinking through and citing and rereading the same texts as I have, as Judah showed us just now. Every day I am grateful for that fact. Okay, in the 1959 documentary film The Cry of Jazz, director and composer Ed Bland captures the musical genius of jazz as a unique expression of the Negro. The film features live performances from Sun Ra and Miles Davis, who I recently learned that there is no such thing, presenting the earliest iterations of that which is now interpreted as Afrofuturism. Following the film's opening credits, the viewer is brought to a room of black and white concertgoers who are mingling after the show. Dialogue is very plain and orchestrated. It's 1959, as if to be educational. I'll do the dialogue myself. For context, I don't know if any of these are Jewish, but we can tell by the screen who's white and who's Natalie and John. The names are white, while Lewis and Alex are black. Natalie goes, "Can you tell me what jazz is, Alex?" Lewis says, "Jazz is merely the Negro's cry of joy and suffering." John says, "Well, wait a minute. Lewis, you talk as if Negroes were the only ones who could have created jazz." And Alex says, "Not only did they create jazz, but they were the only ones who could have created jazz." John responds with a futile reminder of the existence of white jazz musicians, to which Alex assures John that the Negro has a special slant on American history. Another white concertgoer, Bruce, joins the conversation and interrupts with a skeptical retort invoking Jewish suffering. It is not made clear, again, whether he or any of them are Jewish. The dialogue continues. Bruce says, "No, if you mean the Negro has suffered, everybody has suffered, and who suffered more than the Jews?" Natalie says, "Yeah, how can you answer that?" Lewis, "Well, a Negro can be Jewish or Catholic. Now, I can lose a leg, and you can lose a leg. Whatever happens to you can happen to me. And in addition, I am Negro." The existential, if not intentional, use of "am" suggests a state of being and speaks to claims of scholars such as Nkwashi, who writes on the black subject as quote, non-relational. Therefore, an anti-black imaginary presumes to have nullified the question how to be, since we either are whatever the world says we are, or are enmeshed in refusing that imposition, unquote. Thus, the narrator of the film shortly thereafter makes the following claim: "The hazard of being Negro begins before birth and extends beyond death." The last few years, and especially months, have brought me much closer to my writing than I could have imagined, closer to theory, to poetry, to grief. Our futures are forecast and our problems broadcast. Some say pessimism is just easier. And though Frank Wilderson may not actually be advocating for pessimism, but rather describing how blackness followed him throughout his travels, as it is a memoir critique, his book, Afropessimism. For some years before, Jared Sexton wrote of Afropessimism, and he uses the dash, as a moment, that it emerges at a certain inaugural moment. Suffice it to say, these 2 days have made me feel like I am part of another inaugural moment. So imagine my surprise last fall as I was wrapping up my thesis in Israel about pessimist theory, finally affirmed by Professor Belinda Brau's predictions. Looking back, and I offer this comment by a fellow thinker of Nietzsche, as he recalled in 1873, he summarized his historical approach as, quote, "We feel by theory." So since the fall, I have especially struggled to toe the line between the subject of my thesis and its object, which will be discussed here, and which has increasingly felt to me to be an account of my own experience, an autoethnography, a diary even. We'll see how my committee deals with that. A failure to be either objective or subjective, which is to say of my identities, being an American Jewish descendant of Ashkenazi trauma, and by the way, I appreciate all the mentions of Detroit, near where I grew up, which itself could be a case study in this black Jewish canon, who went to Haifa to study it formally, this drama. And Haifa is famously a highly mixed city, demographically, Ashkenazi Jews, Arab and Palestinian Christians and Muslims, Druze, Baha'i, Ethiopians, Yemenites, Russians, and Moroccans, Iranians. Judeopessimism, then, is, as Shai put it yesterday, best described as just another Wednesday. Looking deeper, it is a language which borrows from Afro-pessimism, which posits blackness as born in opposition to whiteness and crucially cannot be reconciled under what might be called our Western systems of thought and political economy, which also dismisses activism and efforts toward emancipation. Much has also been written in the way of a certain Jewish Jewish pessimist theory, though not officially given a name until Professor McGee's article and chapter on Meir Kahana. He and I have since focused on this terminology through the lens of anti-Semitism, Holocaust memory, and theology, confronting questions of nationhood, power, race, and the paradox of Jewish victimhood, while holding indisputable privilege as a minority, and after which a state has been named. Those who are familiar with the emotive weight of anti-Semitism, for example, manifest in Professor Heschel's work and even Professor Penslar's recent book, Zionism and Emotional State, are likely familiar with learned victimhood, maintained by the status quo of alarmism in academic and intellectual circles. In recent articles with titles such as "They're Coming After Us" and "Longing for Auschwitz," the former written by John Podhoretz in January, whose father was writing My Deeper Problem than Ours in the 60s, and the latter by the historian Alvin Rosenfeld in March. So they present identical arguments about the consensus of jeopardy in the Jewish psyche, as well as, at times, physical jeopardy. Thus, in the same rhetorical vein, I finally settled on calling my thesis "Longing for Despair." Beyond myself, then, I turn to ethno-methodology in my thesis, those folk methods, tacit knowledge, routine practices, and ordinary language, along with empirical data to produce a framework which describes the inner workings and implications of collective or intersubjective experience, but does not make a scientific, does not claim a scientific truth about objective reality. So consider the long and arduous pursuit in defining anti-Semitism and as to whether it makes sense that it would have a life of its own. We know, of course, that anti-Semitism is a word, like anti-Judaism. They refer to a social scientific category, and being a matter of social studies will also change in meaning. Words do not have a life of their own, unlike facts of nature, which will certainly outlive us, if that is in fact what we mean when we say to have a life of its own. The concept of survival is of keen interest over time. From Jonathan Butcher in 1986, Sacred Survival, or the recent book Survival, Theological Political Genealogy by Adam Stern. Both suggest survival as a particularly distinct, if not sanctified, identifier in the long history of Jewish existence. We have Sala Baron cautioning against the lachrymose view of Jewish history. Furthermore, in my interpretation, survival is an innate function of reality and evolutionary biology, whereas bigotry is not, or is it? Survival, or surviving, is precipitated by a threatening force, either real or perceived. Now, a short quote from Kafka, Trial. He's in court, K, the character K. "I'm not prejudiced against you," said the priest. "Thank you," said K. "But all the others who are involved in the proceedings are prejudiced against me, and they even pass their prejudice on to those who are not involved. My position is getting more and more difficult." "You misunderstand the situation," says the priest. "The verdict does not come all of a sudden. The proceedings gradually turn into the verdict." "So that's how it is," said Kay, bowing his head. In these last few months, I've had to adjust for scale as I was bearing witness to history. I started my thesis before October and really reinvent it. And there I was back in the 2000s when I was taught over dinner, of course, simply because of how I was born would be grounds for being the target of another group, and that I should learn to appreciate this. When my grandmother, my Bobby, left us 1 month into this new paradigm in November, so did the living memory of her family, and I still don't know why or how to appreciate being a target when my grandparents' families remained buried in the ground they were forced to dig. I do know, having been raised on Motown and corned beef, on that very double-baked rye bread Professor Greenberg showed us this morning, that my other grandmother foretold this day many years ago around that time of the dinner. And how do grandmothers always know? To reflect the current moment in contrast to this opposition to time, I consult in my thesis recent surveys and statistics for a brief rereading of two major works on anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism to provide additional reasoning for why people may feel pessimistic, this illusion of choice, so to speak, namely Nierenberg's anti-Judaism, the Western tradition, and one by Robert Wistrich, anti-Semitism, the longest nature, off-cited. I explore the genealogy of Jewish pessimism, which turns out to be quite old itself, found in Ecclesiastes, and in the story of Rabbi Akiva laughing at the sight of the temple's destruction. I focus on modes of cultural production as they have the capacity to convince Jews, particularly in North America, the UK, and Europe, that it is socially and politically desirable to claim the badge of perpetual victimhood. This brings us back once again to Jews and whiteness, and the desire to be emancipated from various perceptions set forth by Western academia, stuck between modernities. One might begin with the actual beginning. Professor Carter, here in his 2008 book, Race: A Theological Account, suggests a possible point of entry. Quote, Jews in the guise of ancient biblical Israel are either the prototype or the antitype, end quote. Once again, the typecast of the Jew is located both at the genesis and end of modernity, via Enzo Traverso, for example, in service of the Western tradition due to the plasticity of opposition imposed on this particular identity. Professor Carter's theological account of race history complements the more contemporary complexities of identity formation. Identities can be fluid, as we know, additive. An individual can hold more than one identity. And staying for a moment in antiquity, Jewish religious beliefs were commonly synchronous with both Greek and Roman religions. Which then arises the question, when are the Jews? Simon Dubnoff deemed the Jewish people to be, quote, immortal, while Ernst Bloch tells us that the mere fact of the Jews' existence opposes to time. And yet this body, only has so much of it. In fact, even the little ones are confronted with mortality here and overseas. A few years ago, for instance, a man drove to a Jewish preschool not far from where I grew up in Michigan, driving from a nearby city, threatening anyone in sight. That day, my mother was inside with her class, tying shoelaces, learning manners, social skills. How does it look? Which brings us to my title here. Which brings us to 1937, a peek through a mirror. What can we gather from this page of the Chicago Defender? Thank you, Ben, for sharing this with me. Does it simply speak for itself? The Jews in white Europe as black, and the Jews in then British colonial South Africa as full citizens, which echoes the work of Professor Partridge. And to illustrate the convergence of Jewish and black victimhood, in 1915, the American Marxist magazine, The Masses, behind the Southern Gentleman, each on separate crosses, a double crucifixion, uncomplimentary caricatures of a Jewish man first, then of an African man. What is illustrated here in the American context, whose 1920s, shortly thereafter, saw the KKK's membership reach at least 2 million. It reminds me of César's notion of Hitlerism, as heard from Professor Abuneke. Did I pronounce that correctly? Thumbs up, all right. The colonial quasi-Christian fantasy of domination, or Lebensraum, or by way of Professor Carter, we are back to Du Bois' ownership of the earth forever. Amen. At least I can assume the magazine editors believed the earth is round. As Professor McGee has set to work out in his own terms this notion of Judeopessimism by theorizing modern Jewish identity as a permanent negation, so to speak, of European Christianity in the binary, reiterating this Western tradition in Nierenberg's book. Here's some iconography at left from Notre Dame, Ecclesia representing Christianity, bearing a staff in the left hand, adorned, and a goblet in the right, symbolizing enlightenment. whereas synagoga represents Judaism, blinded by the body of a snake. In the left hand is a broken staff with a crown lying at the base, and in the other hand is a set of tablets, a symbol of the absolute word, the absolute word. To the right, we have a blue figure situated between two blue bars, wearing a yellow star on his chest. The figure's face is aimed downward, and wears the yellow star as if to replace the star in the middle of the Israeli flag. The weary expression alludes to the pocket-sized connections between anti-Semitism, with a dash, the state of Israel, and the Holocaust, which still rings of Eichmann but proceeds by the war of 1967. These expansions of vocabulary intervene in the now decades-long pursuit to define anti-Semitism, formative Jewish identity, blackness, in addition to the hegemony of Holocaust memory in defining Jewish identity, including my own. In 2022 then, the traveling exhibition of the Nazi-era cattle car replica in Times Square, and late last year, after the events of October and the trigger it proved to be, Holocaust memory was also triggered as the most available historical analogy for comprehending any scale of Jewish re-traumatization. The proverbial expectation of future victimhood does not vacate Jewish identity, but has rather come to define it. So we're back at Judeopessimism, which is what this owes a great deal to. It's an extensive intellectual tradition, often dated, it's dated often to Du Bois, through Derek Bell and Oscar Patterson in the 70s and 80s. In this tradition, Judeopessimism may be defined as that which includes the affective or ontological political theory or attitude of acceptance toward the longevity of anti-Jewishness through the evolution of interacting cultures over thousands of years. It's rather general. Arguably culminating in the Holocaust, otherwise known by some as the end or fracturing of modernity itself. The sociologist Zygmunt Bauman wrote extensively on this fracture and is actually quoted to have said, "Quietism is pessimism." We can find parallels in the leading voices of 20th century decolonialist political theory, such as Fanon, Césaire, and C.L.R. James, who were quite familiar with Nazi Germany's racial motivations, as we've been exploring, not just by mere fact, but by their own existence of being Afro-Caribbean or Black. Du Bois, as Ben shared with us yesterday, visited many sites, including the Warsaw Ghetto, and in that 1952 essay wrote that the, quote, certain social provincialism of Jews in Nazi Germany could contribute to a, quote, broader conception of what the fight against race segregation, religious discrimination, and the oppression by wealth could amount to in the Black imaginary. Indeed, C.L.R. James would, in his body of work, borrow from the discourse on Jewish suffering when he referred to the Negro question, which is really not specific to Jewish suffering in 1939 and 1945, and the race pogroms of the Negro in 1943. Wilderson even recalls in his work a Palestinian friend at a checkpoint who writes, his friend says, "The shameful and humiliating way the soldiers run their hands up and down your body," he said. Then he added, "But the shame and humiliation runs even deeper if the Israeli soldier is an Ethiopian Jew. The earth gave way. The thought that my place in the unconscious of Palestinians fighting for their freedom was the same dishonorable place I occupied in the minds of whites in America and Israel children." Pardon me. So I'll come back to Fanon, but briefly, Jewishness is a figurative and real thing, and Fanon knew this, as we've recently just heard, in a certain ontological solidarity with his Jewish brethren. In Black Skin, White Masks, in the chapter titled "The Fact of Blackness," again referring to this fact of beingness, Fanon articulates the identity as it relates to the Jungian notion of an innate collective unconscious. Moving forward due to time, what of this cattle car? Stationed in the middle of Times Square over a year ago as part of a traveling exhibition to increase awareness and education of the Holocaust, the act of placing such an object in such a place contains so much absence, even in Times Square. The murmurs and eventual silence in those trains some 80 years ago. However, this specific cattle car is a replica, so it would perhaps be more prudent to view what it contains as indeed a replica of this absence. An attempt perhaps to evoke in its viewers what was referenced yesterday as the flashlight knowledge via Walter Benjamin, juxtaposed by the flashlight experience of perhaps the most flash-like city center outside maybe Tokyo. The cattle car is thus profound and banal, representing cultural pessimism, which has reached Germany, France, respectively Mark Schmidt, Spectres of Pessimism, and Esther Van Bossel from France, Suffering as Identity, the Jewish Paradigm. Cultural pessimism rests its central claim on knowing and guaranteeing the future and fate of its subject. In 1980, the French intellectual Alain Finkielkraut in The Imaginary Jew reckons with Holocaust memory in a postmodern world. To the question of whether anti-Semitism is an outdated relic, he responds, "Nothing permits such optimism." So I would like to ask him, were something to permit such optimism, what would it be? Right. So far, what I and others have attempted is what Elad Lapidot has called interepistemology from last year's workshop, referring to the discussion between discourses, and that's really what's happening here. In my thesis, I explore the tensions between histories and modes of pessimistic approaches, and thinking through what Jean Emery called the dualistic impossibility and necessity of being a Jew. Just by being, one has to justify their identity, which becomes a matter of justifying one's existence. So as James Baldwin said, in America I was free only in battle, and never free to rest. And he who finds no way to rest cannot survive the battle. Even though I'm almost out of time, I just want to say my favorite Baldwin quote, spoken in Beaufort Delaney's studio. He said, I know I can't drive a truck or run a bank. I can't count, and I can't lead a movement, but I can F up your mind. It has now become clear that the battle for and within Jewish identity has been cast directly onto the international spotlight by virtue of a physical battle in which Jews neither in Israel nor the diaspora can seem to find any possibility of rest. Afro-pessimists make a similar claim about the unique non-existence of black autonomy in the West. So this philosophy is the analytical tool to think about what we might call Judeopessimism. Wilderson writes, blackness and slaveness are inextricably bound in such a way that whereas slaveness can be separated from blackness, blackness cannot exist other than slaveness. By this logic, perhaps the ghetto can be separated from Jewishness, but Jewishness cannot exist recognizably in the post-World War II era without this. Finally, apologies. Shame I have to leave a little bit more fun out. Judeo-pessimism represents a particular aspect of Jewish identity formation, and so too does the concept speak to a long tradition of evolving terminologies to describe social facts, social order, and the language of this evolution. We've seen what might be the risk of comparison, of analogy. The relic of the cattle car, after all, is quite unlike the slave ship, if we were going there, as the train car as both contain the imminent stench of death. But the slave ship enacted social death on the black body and ensuring natal alienation from its native soul. I hope it will be possible, though I've already seen that it is possible these last 2 days, for just furthest reaches of understanding beyond the identifiers of anti-Semitism, Zionism, and Holocaust memory are closer than we think. Thank you.